The wind crossed the Knife River breaks before dawn, pulling loose snow against a shanty that had no business standing. No trees between the cabin and the horizon, no smoke from the stovepipe. The woodpile beside the door was short enough to count. A child could have stacked it in an afternoon and called it finished. Beyond the cabin, 4 cows stood in an open lean-to, their breath freezing white in the dark, their ribs beginning to show through winter coats that had not thickened the way a healthy animal's would. A woman crouched at the edge of a trench she had dug into the frozen ground. Her hands were split at the knuckles. The trench ran toward the cabin like a scar. Marit Vangen reached the claim on the 26th of October, 1887, riding beside a freight driver who would not look at her. The driver had known Odmund. Everyone between Dickinson and the Knife River breaks had known Odmund, or claimed to, and every one of them had an opinion about what his widow ought to do with 160 acres of grass, debt, and unfinished shelter. The driver's opinion he kept to himself. He led her down at the track rut that passed for a road, handed her the canvas bag, and clicked his team east without saying goodbye. The claim sat on a low shelf of prairie above a shallow draw, wind-scoured and treeless except for a ragged line of cottonwood along the creek a quarter-mile south. 12 acres had been broken. The rest was buffalo grass gone brown under the first hard frost. The house, if a person could call it a house, measured 12 feet by 16. Plank front wall, sod-packed back wall, a roof of cottonwood poles and tarred canvas patched in 3 places with flour sacking. The cellar beneath was no deeper than a kneeling child. A rusted stovepipe leaned from the roof at an angle that promised trouble in any wind stronger than a whisper. Odmund Vangen had died 11 days earlier. The wagon had rolled while he hauled the last load of cut hay from a neighbor's field, and the weight of it broke him across a wheel's spoke. He lived 4 hours, long enough to ask for water and not long enough to drink it. He left behind his wife, his debt, his stock, his half-built shelter, and his dead sister's child. Eli Vangen stood in the doorway of the shanty, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large and no shoes. She was 8 years old. Her mother had died of fever that spring in a boarding house in Bismarck, and Odmund had taken her because there was no one else. Now there was only Marit, and Marit had not chosen any of this. She had married Odmund in a church in Benson County 14 months ago. She had expected a farm. She had gotten a grave and a girl and a piece of paper that said she owed Lawson Rusk $47.60. The survival math was simple enough that a child could understand it, and brutal enough that understanding changed nothing. Marit owned 4 dairy cows, 7 shoats not yet full grown, 1 team of draft mares worn past their good years, 11 laying hens, and 2 fall calves still on milk. She had 1.5 cords of cottonwood stacked against the south wall, most of it green and smoking when it burned. She had 2 tons of hay, much of it damp from a torn tarpaulin and already going sour at the center. 6 sacks of oats, 5 sacks of wheat, a tin of lard, a sack of salt, and $22 in coin hidden inside a coffee tin beneath the floorboards. The nearest coal dealer in Dickinson was 22 miles east over open ground. A normal winter required at least 6 cords of seasoned hardwood or its coal equivalent to heat even a small dwelling, plus hay enough to keep cattle alive through March. She had neither. She had nothing close to either, and the first snow had already fallen twice in the hills to the north. She could not leave. The animals were collateral on the debt note. The claim was not proved up, 5 years residence required, and Odmund had filed only 2 years before. Walking away meant forfeiting the land, losing the animals to Rusk, and arriving in Dickinson or Bismarck with a child, no trade, and no family within 4,000 miles of ocean. The nearest Vangen relative was in Hardanger, Norway. Marit had 6 cents worth of postage, and no one to write to who could help before spring. She stood in that doorway beside Eli and looked at the stovepipe leaning in the wind, and she did not cry. She had cried for Oddmund at the burial. There was no time left for anything except counting. 3 days after Marit arrived, Asa Whitcomb rode onto the claim without being asked. Whitcomb was 54 years old, a former trail boss who had driven cattle from Texas to Montana twice before the railroads cut the route short. He had settled on 320 acres along the Knife River and built a house with proper framing, a stone-footed barn, and a wife who kept lace curtains in every window. He was not a cruel man. He was an honest man, which in that country was often worse because honest men told you exactly how bad things were and left you no room to pretend otherwise. He dismounted at the lean-to where the cows stood in mud and looked at the claim the way a surgeon looks at a wound he cannot close. "You have half a house," Whitcomb said. He kicked the base of the sod wall, and a chunk the size of his fist broke free. "Wet sod. That wall will slump before January." Marit said nothing. She was stacking the green cottonwood into shorter ranks to let air reach the cuts. Whitcomb walked to the hay. He pulled a fistful from the center of the nearest pile, held it to his nose, and dropped it. "Heating in the middle. You will lose half this stack to mold before December." "I know," Marit said. "You have maybe 1.5 cords. He looked at the wood pile. "You need 6. You have no coal. You have no way to get coal without selling an animal. And if you sell an animal, Rusk will take the rest as security." He turned to face her directly. The wind pulled at his hat brim, and he held it with one hand. "Sell the cows before they freeze. Pay the note. Take the girl east." "And the claim?" "The claim is already gone," Whitcomb said. "You just have not admitted it." He walked past the cow lean-to where the pigs had broken through a gap in the fence rails and rooted under the straw bedding. He kicked the loose straw apart. Steam rose from the manure-packed earth beneath it. He saw rot. He saw waste. "Pigs kept near cattle will foul the bedding and bring scours," Whitcomb said. "Separate them, or you will lose calves." Marit looked at the steam. She looked at it the way a person looks at a word in a language they have not spoken since childhood, half recognized, not yet translatable. She said nothing. Whitcomb mounted his horse and rode back toward his stone-footed barn and his lace-curtained windows. That night, the temperature dropped to 9 degrees above zero, and the stovepipe joint leaked smoke into the shanty until Eli coughed herself awake at 2 a.m. Marit carried the girl outside, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and held her in the cold air until the coughing stopped. The stars were dense and sharp. The cattle shifted in the lean-to, their breath rising in white columns. Somewhere under the straw, the pigs grunted and settled, and Marit could see the faintest curl of steam where they had rooted deepest. She filed it away. Not a plan. Not yet. Just heat where there should not have been heat, and a memory she had not thought about in years. The memory came back 4 mornings later, when Eli woke shivering under 2 quilts and the stove had burned to ash because the green cottonwood would not hold a fire through the night. Marit went to the cow lean-to before dawn. The ground was frozen in the open, stiff enough to ring under her boot heel. But near the corner where the pigs had escaped again and rooted under the cattle straw, the frost was thinner. She knelt. She pushed her bare hand into the bedding, past the dry top straw, past the damp middle layer, into the pack where manure and old straw and pig rooting had mixed together into something dense and dark. It was warm, not surface warm, not the fading warmth of a body recently moved, deep warm, living warm, the kind of heat that came from the inside and pushed outward and did not stop. She pulled her hand free and sat back on her heels. Her fingers steamed in the November air. Her mother had shown her this. In Norway, in the barn behind the stone house in Hardanger, her mother had pressed a hand into the winter bedding where the cows stood and said, "Feel that. Rot is only fire with no flame." Marit had been 9. She had thought it was a strange thing to say about dirty straw. Her mother had explained that when straw and manure sat together in the right way, wet enough to work, dry enough on top to breathe, the rot itself made heat. The creatures too small to see ate the straw and the dung, and their eating was a kind of burning, slow and steady and warm. Marit had filed the lesson the way children file all lessons from parents, without urgency, without context, without knowing which ones will someday matter. Now the lesson had context, it had urgency, and it had company, because alongside the memory of her mother's hand in the straw came another thought, harder and more practical. The animals themselves were furnaces. A dairy cow breathed out heat with every exhale. 4 cows in an enclosed space could raise the air temperature by degrees that mattered. 7 pigs, rooting and eating and turning, added more. And if the straw beneath them was rotting in the right way, not sour, not drowned, but alive with the slow fire of decomposition, the floor itself became a heat source. The method formed in pieces across the next 2 days, each piece tested against what she knew and what she lacked. First, the animals already created heat, but the lean-to was open on 2 sides, and the heat vanished into the Dakota wind before it could accumulate. Second, straw and manure could hold and multiply that heat if layered properly. Wet enough at the core to decompose, dry enough on top to let foul air escape, turned often enough to keep the rot alive and prevent the sour, airless decay that killed the warmth and poisoned the lungs. Third, pigs could turn the pack. A pig rooted by nature, driving its snout into bedding, flipping straw, opening air channels, mixing manure into fresh material. What Whitcomb called fouling, Marit recognized as stirring. The pigs were not contaminating the bedding. They were composting it. Fourth, earth insulated better than planks. The shanty walls leaked wind through every gap, but the ground 2 feet down held steady temperature year-round, cold in summer, but far warmer than the surface air in winter. A shelter dug below grade and covered with earth would lose heat slowly, the way a root cellar held cool. Fifth, if the barn sat lower than the cabin, and a covered trench connected the 2 spaces, the warm air rising from the animals and the composting pack would creep along the trench and seep upward through the cabin floor. The coldest wind would pass over the top. The warmth would travel underground. She sketched the design in the frost on the cabin's one window using her fingernail. A sunken earthen barn, 32 feet long by 18 feet wide, dug 5 feet below grade on the lee side of a low rise southeast of the cabin. Walls of packed clay faced with sawed blocks. Roof of cottonwood poles, salvaged planks, brush, hay, then 2 feet of earth. A covered trench, 4 feet wide, 5 feet deep, running 36 feet from the barn's upper corner to a crawl space beneath the cabin. 2 adjustable vent shafts made from stovepipe and barrel hoops to release foul air without losing all the warmth. It was not a building plan. It was a gamble drawn on glass. Nell Katie arrived the next afternoon with a pot of boiled turnips and a face that said she had heard about the digging. Nell was 31, the wife of a dryland farmer 2 miles north, a woman who had buried 1 child to croup and lost 2 calves to scours in the same week the previous spring. She did not mock what she did not understand. She feared what she knew, and what she knew was that animals kept warm in filth got sick, and sick animals near children made children sick, and there was no doctor closer than Dickinson. "I am not telling you to stop," Nell said, setting the turnip pot on the stove. "I am asking you whether you have thought about Eli." Marit had thought about nothing except Eli since the morning the girl coughed blood-flecked mucus into a rag. "Warm filth is still filth," Nell said. "My calves died in clean straw that turned wet. Yours will be manure from the start." This was the practical doubt, the doubt that came from experience and not from contempt, and Marit respected it enough to answer with action instead of argument. She led Nell to the lean-to. She pulled back the top layer of dry straw and showed the composting pack beneath. Dark, steaming, dense, but not slimy, not black, not sour. "Smell it," Marit said. Nell leaned close. She expected the sharp ammonia stink of a sick barn. Instead, the smell was earthy, warm, almost sweet beneath the animal tang, like soil after rain, like a garden turned in spring. Marit lifted a board she had set over the lowest point near the fence and showed drainage stones she had laid in a shallow channel. Water from the bedding seeped through the straw, filtered through the stones, and ran downhill toward the draw. The surface stayed damp, not pooled. She pushed a peeled willow rod into the bedding. It slid in 2 feet before resistance. She pulled it out. The bottom 6 inches were warm to the touch. The tip was hot. "If it drowns, it sours and the heat dies," Marit said. "If it stays too dry, nothing rots. The trick is the middle. Keep the middle alive and the top dry and the bottom draining." Nell looked at the willow rod steaming in the November air. She looked at Eli playing with a stick near the door. She looked at Marit's hands, which were already cracked at the knuckles from digging in half-frozen clay. "And if the middle goes wrong, then I open it up and start the layers again. Under your floor, while Eli sleeps above it." "Yes." Nell took the turnip pot when she left. She did not promise to return. The gamble had a price, and Marit calculated it that night by lamplight while Eli slept. If she sold the cows now, she could pay Rusk's note and buy passage east. She would arrive in Bismarck with a child, no animals, no income, and no prospects. She would lose the claim, the milk, the calves coming in spring, the manure, and every chance of building something that could sustain them beyond one season. If she kept the cows and tried to winter them in the open lean-to, they would likely die. 2 tons of damp hay would last perhaps 6 weeks if rationed hard. After that, the cows starved or froze, the debt note came due, and Rusk took whatever was left. If she built the buried barn, she spent her body and her time on a structure that no one in the territory had built before. Not because no one had thought of it, because everyone who thought about it had thought past it to the obvious conclusion that mixing species underground near a living space was dangerous, dirty, and likely to produce disease faster than warmth. She had $22. Nails cost money. Lamp oil cost money. Salt for the animals cost money. The shovel handle was cracked and needed replacing. She could not afford to build the barn and fail. She could barely afford to build it and succeed. But the math kept coming back to one number, 6 cords. That was what she needed and did not have and could not get. Everything else, the food, the hay, the animals, those problems had partial solutions. The fuel problem had none. Unless she stopped thinking of fuel as something bought and started thinking of it as something grown in the straw, grown in the manure, grown in the bodies of animals who ate and breathed and radiated warmth whether a person planned for it or not. She blew out the lamp. Under the floorboards, the faint warmth from the shallow cellar was not enough to feel, but she knew it was there. Heat rose, cold sank, earth held steady. The question was whether she could trap enough warmth underground to push it upward through 36 feet of covered trench and into a 12 by 16-foot cabin where a child slept under two quilts and still shivered. She did not know. She decided to find out. The trip to Dickinson took a full day each way in the November cold. Marit left Eli with Nell Katie, though Nell's expression when she agreed could have curdled fresh milk. Rusk and Bell Dry Goods occupied the best corner lot in Dickinson, a proper frame building with glass windows and a cast-iron stove that the men around town treated as a public hearth. The men sat on barrels and nail kegs and talked about cattle prices and the railroad spur, and whose claim would fail before spring. They stopped talking when Marit walked in. Lawson Rusk was 42, lean-faced, clean-shaven, and precise in the way that a man is precise when he has learned that precision is more frightening than anger. He owned the store. He held 6 debt notes from homesteaders in the Knife River country. He had acquired 2 claims outright when the holders failed to pay, and he had sold both at profit to cattlemen who wanted grazing range. He did not need to be cruel. He needed only to wait, and winter did the work for him. He greeted Marit by name and expressed sorrow about Odmund. He meant it, or at least that part of him which could feel sorrow, while simultaneously calculating the value of 4 dairy cows at a winter distress price. Marit asked for nails, lamp oil, salt, and a roll of tarred paper, on credit. Rusk opened the ledger. He ran his finger down the column of figures beside Odmund's name and stopped at the total. $47.60. He looked up. Mrs. Vangen, I'm not a hard man, but credit extended on a debt already owed is a second bet placed on a horse already lame. A man by the stove laughed. Another coughed to cover the same sound. Marit said she would pay in coin for the nails and the salt. She asked the price. Nails are 3 cents a pound. Salt is $2 the barrel. Rusk paused. May I ask what the nails and tarred paper are for? Building. Building what? Marit told him. Not all of it. Enough. She said she was digging a shelter for the animals below grade and connecting it to the cabin. Rusk's expression did not change. He turned to the men by the stove the way a man turns to an audience he knows is already with him. She is digging a hog grave with a roof, Rusk said. The phrase traveled. By the time Marit had paid for the nails and a new shovel handle and left the store with her canvas sack, 2 cowboys at the livery were already repeating it. By nightfall, children near the boarding house were chanting it in the street. Hog grave, the Vangen woman built a hog grave. They did not know what it meant. They knew it was funny because the adults laughed. Outside the store, the confrontation found her before she could reach the wagon. Asa Whitcomb had come to town for wire. He stood beside his horse with a coil of it over his shoulder, and his honest face set in the expression of a man who has heard something he hoped not to hear. You are mixing cattle and pigs in an underground room, Whitcomb said. It was not a question. Yes. Under your cabin floor. Connected to it, through a trench. That is how you lose every animal and the child. Nell Katie was there too, loading flour onto a neighbor's wagon. She did not speak. She looked at Marit with the face of someone watching a friend walk toward a cliff in the dark. Rusk appeared in the doorway of his store. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed. Mrs. Vangen, Rusk said, I say this with respect. If you sign over the stock today, I can clear the note and arrange passage to Bismarck by Friday. The girl would be warm by Sunday. The offer was reasonable. Every person within earshot knew it was reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Reasonable offers from men who bought distressed claims were the gentlest kind of trap because the teeth were hidden inside the logic, and the logic was sound. Marit looked at Rusk. She looked at Whitcomb. She looked at Nell. I need 12 pounds of nails, she said, and one more sack of salt, and then I'm going home. She paid in coins so cold they stuck to her palm. The metal left red marks on her skin that did not fade until she was 5 miles from town. Eli was asleep at the Katy place when Marit returned. Nell said the girl had asked whether pigs really made children sick. Nell had said she did not know. Marit carried Eli to the wagon, tucked the blanket around her legs, and drove home in the dark. Are pigs dirty? Eli asked. Everything is dirty, Marit said. The question is what kind of dirty and whether it is working for you or against you. Eli did not understand. Marit was not sure she understood either. Not yet. Not completely. But the memory of her mother's hand in the steaming straw was sharper now than it had been in 17 years, and the heat that had risen from the bedding that morning was not a theory. It was a temperature. It was a number she could build around. She began digging on the 3rd of November. The site was 60 yards southeast of the cabin, on the lee side of a low rise where the ground sloped toward the draw. She marked the outline with twine staked at the corners, 32 feet long, 18 feet wide. She marked the trench line with ash poured from a bucket, a pale stripe across the brown grass running from the barn site to the cabin's southeast corner, 36 feet of covered passage. The first day she moved 14 cubic feet of earth. The second day she moved 11 because the topsoil gave way to clay 2 feet down, and clay in November in Dakota territory was not soil. It was stone that had not yet made up its mind. Her shoulders seized by the 4th hour, her palms blistered through the work gloves by the 6th. She stopped when the light failed and ate cold oatmeal standing beside the trench, because sitting down meant standing up again, and she was not certain her legs would cooperate. The shovel blade rang against the clay. The sound carried across the flat ground. Eli sat on a turn bucket near the cabin and watched. The cows stood in the lean-to and breathed white vapor into the dusk. The pigs rooted at the fence rail, pushing their snouts toward straw that was no longer there because Marit had moved it to line the bottom of the first 4 feet of trench. By November 8th, the trench was 12 feet long and 4 feet deep. The barn pit was staked but barely scratched. The sky had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind shifted north and stayed there. Marit could feel the season tightening around the claim like a hand closing on a rope. She had 43 days until the solstice. She had twice that before the worst cold would come. But the ground was freezing deeper every night, and soon the clay would be beyond the reach of a shovel and a woman who weighed 129 pounds. If you have ever built something that other people could not understand, tell us in the comments what kept you going when they doubted you. On the 9th of November, a man she did not know stopped his wagon on the track road and watched her dig for 10 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, he touched his hat and drove on. She never learned his name. She went back to the clay. The trench grew a foot a day when the weather held, and half a foot when it did not. She hit a seam of gravel at 5 feet that drained well and decided that was her floor. She lined the trench bottom with the flattest stone she could carry from the creek bed. The stones were cold enough to burn her hands. She wrapped them in burlap to carry them and laid them in rows, and told herself that each stone was 1 less inch of standing water in February. By the 15th of November, the trench was 22 feet long. The barn pit was dug to 3 feet across its full footprint. Her hands were split at every knuckle. She had used $4 of her remaining 22 on lamp oil and a barrel stave she needed for a vent cap form. She had eaten nothing but oatmeal, salt pork, and boiled wheat for 9 days. The first real snow came on November 16th. It filled the open trench to the brim and turned the barn pit into a white bowl. Marit spent the entire next day shoveling snow instead of digging earth, and when she finished, The clay walls had cracked in two places where the meltwater froze again overnight. She sat on the edge of the trench at dusk and looked at the cracks in the snow-filled pit and the gray sky, and the distance between what she had done and what remained. The cattle needed to be under earth before deep winter. The trench needed to be covered before it filled again. The cabin crawl space needed to be opened and connected. The vent shafts needed to be built. The roof needed poles and planks and brush and hay and 2 feet of sod. And she had none of those things staged, and the ground was freezing harder every night. If she stopped now, she had a half-dug trench and a hole in the ground, and 22 days of wasted labor, and a body that felt 10 years older than it had in October. If she continued, she might finish in time or she might not. And the difference between those two outcomes was the difference between a warm floor and a frozen one, between live calves and dead ones, between Eli's next birthday and a marker beside Oddman's grave. The wind picked up. Snow hissed across the open ground and poured into the trench like sand filling a ditch. Marit climbed out, walked to the cabin, fed the stove the last of the dry cottonwood, and sat beside Eli on the bed. "Are we going to live here?" Eli asked. "Yes," Marit said. "Is it going to be warm?" Marit looked at the frost forming on the inside of the window. She looked at the thin plank wall that shuddered in the wind. She looked at the stovepipe joint where smoke leaked in a slow curl that would wake them both coughing before dawn. "It is going to be warm," she said, "but I have to build the warm first." She did not know whether that was true. She knew that stopping was the same as giving in, and giving in was the same as signing over the stock to Lawson Rusk, and signing over the stock was the same as losing the claim, and losing the claim was the same as arriving in Bismarck with nothing, and nothing was the same as a grave with no name on it, because nobody remembered the women who walked away from claims they could not hold. Outside, the trench filled with snow. The pigs grunted in the lean-to. The cows shifted and breathed. Heat rose from the straw where no one had asked it to, silent and stubborn and free. Marit had not yet met the man who would teach her how to keep the walls from falling. She had not yet faced the storm that everyone would remember. She had not yet learned whether the fire with no flame could be built large enough and fast enough and clean enough to hold back a Dakota winter. But the digging would continue in the morning. Dr. Torgrim Neschheim appeared on the morning of November 20th, walking beside a mule that looked as old and stubborn as its owner. He was 62, Norwegian-born, with a bent left knee that swung outward with each step like a gate on a broken hinge. He wore a wool coat patched at both elbows and a hat so battered it had lost its original shape and settled into something that resembled a crushed bucket. He had been a railroad-grade foreman for the Northern Pacific from Minnesota to Montana, and before that a road builder in Telemark, and before that a boy who had watched his father cut drainage channels into mountain pastures so steep that a stumble meant a quarter-mile of falling. He did not introduce himself. He stopped his mule on the track road, watched Marit cutting the trench wall at a steep angle, and stood there long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "You're cutting straight down," he said. Marit looked up. Mud streaked her forehead. Her coat was stiff with frozen clay. "Yes. Straight walls bury people." He tied the mule to the fence post, took the shovel from her hand without asking, and cut the wall at a slant, raking it back 6 inches for every foot of depth. The clay peeled away in clean slabs instead of crumbling in chunks. He drove the blade at a low angle, leveraged it with his knee, and tossed the spoil uphill where it would not slide back in. "A trench is not a well," he said. "A well goes straight because the stone holds it. Clay does not hold. Clay waits until you trust it, then moves." He returned the shovel and looked at the rest of the work. The barn pit, the staked dimensions, the ash line running toward the cabin. He walked the full length of the trench, then crossed to the barn pit and stood at its edge, looking down. "Who taught you the layout?" he asked. "No one. I measured the wind with ash thrown from a bucket. The lee side of this rise blocks the northwest gale. The slope takes water downhill toward the draw." Torgrim said nothing for a long time. He knelt at the barn pit edge and pressed his palm flat against the clay wall. He studied the drainage stones Marit had laid in the trench bottom. He looked at the grade line she had marked with twine. "The grade is right," he said. "The drainage stones are right. The barn dimensions are too wide for the roof timber you have. Narrow it to 16 feet, and you can span it with the cottonwood you have standing along the creek." He did not offer help. He pointed out 3 errors, corrected the wall angle, and began walking back to his mule. "Why did you stop?" Marit asked. Torgrim looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Because you marked grade with twine. A person who marks grade before digging knows what they are doing. Most of the graves out here were dug by people who started cutting before they measured." He left. He came back the next morning with a crosscut saw and 2 forked cottonwood posts, and he did not leave again for 3 weeks. Torgrim did not explain why he helped. Marit did not ask. In the country west of the Knife River, people who asked too many questions about motive received answers they did not want, and people who simply worked beside each other could build trust faster than words allowed. He taught her 3 things, and each one he taught through doing, not telling. The first was trench safety and bracing. On the second day, while Marit dug the barn pit's north wall, a section of clay the size of a hay bale let go without warning and slid into the pit. It missed her by the width of her boot. She stood in the bottom of the 5-foot excavation and looked at the raw scar where the wall had been and understood that she had been digging her own burial. Torgrim did not shout. He climbed down, took her arm, and pulled her to the sloped ramp he had cut that morning. "You brace every 6 feet," he said, "forked posts, cross pieces. You leave no unsupported span longer than the distance a man can jump." He showed her how to set the forked posts against the wall, wedge the cross pieces tight, and drive a stake at the base to prevent the post from kicking out under load. The ground talks before it moves. Listen for cracking. Feel for vibration in the post. If the cross piece shifts, get out. Get out first. Think second. They spent an entire day bracing the barn pit walls before digging another inch. Marit wanted to keep cutting. Every day lost was a day the ground froze deeper. Torgrim would not move until the braces were set. "Speed does not save anyone who is buried," he said. "Slow saves." The second lesson was drainage. Torgrim made Marit dig a sump pit 18 inches below the barn floor level at the downhill corner. He lined it with flat stones from the creek and cut a shallow channel, half an inch of fall across every yard, from the far wall to the sump. The channel ran beneath the straw and could not be seen once the bedding was laid, but it pulled moisture downhill the way a wick pulled oil. "Warm, wet turns sour," he said. "Warm, dry keeps breathing. Your bedding can be damp. It cannot be drowned. The difference is whether the water moves or sits." He made her pour a bucket of water on the barn floor and watch where it traveled. It followed the channel to the sump pit, pooled there, and could be bailed out through a stone-lined gap in the wall. He made her do it 3 times in 3 different spots until she could see the slope without pouring water at all. The third lesson was ventilation, and it was the one that scared Marit most because ventilation meant losing heat, and heat was the one thing she could not afford to lose. Torgrim built 2 vent shafts. The first was a stovepipe section fitted through the barn roof at the highest point, capped with a barrel hoop frame and a hinged tin flap that could be opened or closed from inside using a wire pull. The second was a low vent near the trench mouth, a square hole framed in planks with a sliding board. that controlled the opening from finger width to fist width. "The high vent takes the foul air out," Torgrim said. "Hot air rises. Bad air is hot air. Let it go." "And lose the warmth." "You are not losing warmth. You're trading bad warmth for clean air. The animals make more heat every hour. The bedding makes more heat every hour. You cannot run out of heat if the straw is working. You can run out of air." He proved it. He lit a twist of damp hay and held it at the barn floor level. The smoke pooled along the ground, drifted toward the low vent, and crept out at ankle height. Then he held the smoking hay at shoulder level. The smoke rose, curled along the roof poles, and found the high vent. It pulled upward and vanished into the open air. "If the low smoke does not move," Torgrim said, "the air is dead. Open both vents until it moves. If the high smoke does not rise, the vent is frozen. Break the ice before morning, or the animals breathe poison." Marit watched the smoke draw. She memorized the pattern. She would need it when Torgrim was not there to read the air for her. Progress came in measurements that Marit scratched into a board nailed to the cabin wall. November 24th. Barn pit dug to full depth, 5 feet. 2 cows coughing from exposure in the open lean-to. 1 calf off its milk. November 28th. Barn walls faced with sod blocks cut from the broken ground south of the cabin. Torgrim taught her the Norwegian method, stacking sod grass side down, staggering the joints like brickwork, pressing each layer firm before adding the next. The walls rose 2 feet above grade, just enough to support the roof poles. December 1st, first roof poles laid across the barn, cottonwood trunks cut from the creek line, stripped of bark, notched at the ends to lock onto the wall plates. Marit and Torgrim together could lift the smaller ones. The larger ones required the mares, a rope sling, and language from Torgrim that Marit had not heard since leaving the docks in Bergen. December 4th, roof poles complete, brush layer laid, first hay covering spread. Half the nails gone, all the lamp oil gone. Marit burned tallow candles made from beef fat and cotton twists, and the light they gave was yellow and thin and smelled of something dying. December 8th, earth covering begun. 2 feet of sod and loose dirt piled onto the brush and hay layer. The roof sagged 3 inches at the center span. Torgrim added a center post. A thick cottonwood trunk forked at the top to cradle the ridgepole, and the sag stopped. December 10th. The trench was covered. Salvaged planks laid across the top, then brush, then sod, then earth. It was not a tunnel a person could walk through upright. It was a passage a person could crouch through, dragging a bucket or a lantern, and it connected the barn's upper corner to a new opening cut through the southeast wall of the cabin's shallow cellar. The trench smelled like cold clay and damp wood. When Marit crawled through it for the first time, dragging a lit candle in a tin holder, the flame leaned toward the barn end. Air moved. Not much. Enough. Throughout construction, time worked against her like a second enemy. Every morning the frost line crept deeper. The clay that had been difficult in November became iron in December. The shovel rang and bounced. Torgrim switched to a pick for the last 2 feet of the sump pit, and the impact traveled up his arms and settled into his bent knee until he walked with a limp that worsened with every hour. Setbacks arrived in clusters, the way they always did on the prairie, as if the land saved its punishments for the days when a person was already tired. On November 30th, the barn pit's east wall slumped after freezing rain soaked the sod face, and the temperature dropped overnight. Marit and Torgrim spent a full day rebuilding the wall, cutting new sod blocks from frozen ground, stacking them against the slump, and driving stakes to hold them. One day lost, one day the calendar would not give back. On December 2nd, the older mare went lame on a stone buried in frozen mud. The team was reduced to one pulling animal and an old mule that belonged to Torgrim and obeyed no one, including Torgrim. On December 5th, Lawson Rusk sent word through a passing freighter that the debt note of $47.60 would come due on February 1st. Not spring. February. The freighter delivered the message with the embarrassed look of a man who knew he was carrying a weapon. Marit had $14 left in the coffee tin. She had spent the rest on nails, salt, oil, a barrel of oats, and a roll of tarred paper that Rusk had charged full price because credit was closed. And in the middle of everything, Asa Whitcomb returned. He rode onto the claim on December 7th, sat his horse at the edge of the barn pit, and looked down at the sod walls, the braced corners, the roof poles, and the dark rectangle of the trench mouth. "You built it," he said. "Not finished." "Looks finished enough to bury stock in." "The roof covering is not thick enough yet. The trench needs another layer of sod." Whitcomb dismounted and walked along the trench line, pressing his boot heel into the earth covering at 3 points. He looked at the vent shaft poking above the barn roof, capped with its barrel hoop frame. "First good wind will take that cap off." Torgrim wired it down. "A Dakota blow will take the wire, the cap, and the pipe." He mounted and looked at her from the saddle. "I have seen men build better than this who lost everything in one night. The ground does not care how hard you work." He rode home. Marit stared at the vent cap, and that evening wrapped it in an additional layer of wire secured to a stake driven 2 feet into the earth. She thought about Whitcomb's face as he said it. Not mocking, not hostile. Just the flat certainty of a man who had watched the territory kill people who did everything right and still lost. But there was help that came without announcement or explanation, the way help often came in a country where pride ran deeper than generosity. On the morning of December 9th, Marit found 3 loads of old straw piled beside the barn pit. The straw was dry, golden brown, and smelled of summer. No one was there. The wagon tracks led north toward the Katy place and stopped at the road where the frozen ground held no impressions. Torgrim examined the tracks and the straw and said nothing for a long time. Then, "People help easier in the dark when they are afraid of being seen." Nell Katy never mentioned the straw. Marit never asked. But the straw went into the barn as the first deep bedding layer, and it was the best material Marit had, dry enough to breathe, long enough to hold structure, clean enough to start the composting process without the sour head start that her damp hay would have caused. On December 14th, the animals moved underground. The pigs went first because pigs went wherever food led, and Marit dropped a trail of oat mash down the ramp and into the barn. They followed its snout first, grunting, and within an hour they were rooting in the straw bedding with the blind energy of animals born to turn soil. The cows resisted. Cattle did not trust ramps, did not trust darkness, and did not trust the smell of pigs. Marit spent half a day coaxing the first cow down with a halter and a bucket of oats, walking backward, speaking in the low tone her mother had used with the hard-anger cattle, a sound more vibration than language. The cow placed each hoof as if testing ice. When she reached the barn floor and felt the straw beneath her, she stopped, blew through her nostrils, and stood rigid for 10 minutes. Then she dropped her head and began to eat. The other 3 followed because cattle were herd animals, and loneliness frightened them more than darkness. The bedding was 2 feet deep. Marit had layered it in the pattern. Her mother's memory and Torgrim's drainage lessons dictated stones at the bottom for drainage, a thin layer of brush for air pockets, then alternating layers of dry straw and damp hay mixed with the manure already accumulating from the pigs' first days of rooting. The top layer was dry straw, golden and clean, covering the darker composting mass beneath. Within 2 days, the barn air changed. Not dramatically, not the way a stove changed a room, but the frost that formed on the underside of the roof poles each night was thinner than it had been on the exposed lean-to posts. The cow's breath hung less visibly. The straw at the center of the pack, where the pigs rooted deepest, was warm enough that steam rose in the lantern light when Marit pulled back the top layer. She tested heat the way the period allowed. Touch first, her bare hand pressed into the bedding at different depths and locations. Steam patterns, where the vapor rose thickest, the decomposition worked strongest. Frost lines, where frost formed on the walls and where it did not, told her where the heat reached and where it fell short. And finally, a dairy thermometer borrowed from Nell Katie, pushed inside a tin tube and driven into the bedding core at the center of the barn. The thermometer read 112 degrees at the core, 40 degrees along the wall. Barn air near the cows stood at 28 degrees above zero, when the outside air sat at 10 below. The crawl space under the cabin was cool, not warm, not frozen. Cool. The floorboards near the trench opening felt like autumn, not winter. Near the bed where Eli slept, the floor was cold, but not cracking with frost the way it had before the trench was sealed. It was not enough. Not yet. The system needed time. The composting pack needed to build mass, needed the daily additions of straw and manure that would increase its volume and deepen its heat. The animals needed to settle, to stop burning energy on fear and cold, and start converting feed into body warmth that stayed trapped in the earthen walls. And the system needed management. On the third night, the barn air turned sharp. Marit woke to a headache and a taste like copper on her tongue. She crawled through the trench in the dark, reached the barn, and found the high vent frosted shut. The smoke test, a rag lit and held at floor level, showed dead air pooling along the walls. The pigs were restless. One cow had moved to the ramp, pressing her face toward the outside air. Marit climbed the interior ladder, broke the ice from the vent cap, and opened the flap wide. Cold air poured in. The barn temperature dropped. Eli would feel it through the floor within the hour. She closed the flap to half. The draft eased. The smoke rag showed air moving again, slowly, reluctantly, but moving. She added dry straw to the top of the bedding, spreading it thick to insulate the composting layer below while allowing the surface to breathe. She crawled back through the trench and lay on the cabin floor and listened. The wind above, the settling straw below, the slow, patient breath of cows through 2 feet of earth and 36 feet of covered passage. This was not a system a person built and forgot. This was a living thing that needed reading every day, like weather, like livestock, like a child's cough in the night. Nell Katie came to the door the next morning. She had heard Eli coughing. "The air," Nell said. "I fixed it. The vent froze. I broke the ice." "And tonight? And tomorrow night? And every night when it drops below zero and the vent freezes again?" Marit did not have an answer that would satisfy Nell. She had only the thermometer reading and the frost pattern, and the fact that the cows were still standing, and the pigs were still rooting, and the floorboards were still warmer than the walls. "Come inside," Marit said. Nell would not enter the barn, but she stood at the cabin cellar opening and put her hand against the crawl space air that breathed up through the gap where Marit had lifted a floorboard. It was not warm, it was not cold. It was the temperature of a root cellar in October, wide, neither threatening nor comforting, just steady. "That is coming from the barn," Nell said. "Through the trench, 36 feet. Nell pulled her hand back and looked at Marit the way a person looks at a letter written in a language they cannot read but suspect might contain important news. If Eli gets worse, you bring her to me, Nell said. I will. Promise me. I promise. Nell left. Marit adjusted the vent wire, added straw, fed the cows, and checked the sump pit for standing water. The routine was establishing itself, the daily rhythm of a system that was neither furnace nor animal pen, but something in between, something that required a stockman's eye, a builder's discipline, and a willingness to crawl through 36 feet of dark trench at 2 in the morning when the air turned wrong. Asa Whitcomb's doubt arrived on schedule. He stopped by on December 20th and admitted the cows looked better than he expected. Their coats had not dulled the way exposed cattle dulled in December. The calves were gaining, not losing. But a real Dakota blow has not come yet, Whitcomb said. A real blow will strip the heat out of that barn in one night. The ground does not insulate against wind that finds a crack. He was not wrong. The question was whether there were cracks. January arrived with a strange gentleness that made experienced settlers uneasy. The first week of 1888 brought temperatures that hovered near zero, cold by any measure except Dakota's, where zero was a respite and anything above it felt like mercy. Snow lay thin on the ground. The sky stayed gray, but not threatening. Children played outdoors without coats. Men in Dickinson opened their collars and talked about an easy winter. Marit did not trust it. The cattle were restless in ways she could not explain. The pigs, which had rooted with steady energy since moving underground, lay still for long stretches, their snouts tucked beneath straw. One cow stood at the ramp all morning, facing the sealed door, as if listening for something not yet audible. She checked the bedding, core temperature steady at 118, barn air above freezing, vents clear, drainage flowing. Everything the system could tell her said the system was working. Everything the animals could tell her said something else. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the temperature in western Dakota Territory climbed above 20 degrees. The sun appeared for the first time in days. Snow softened on the south-facing slopes. A man could stand outside without gloves and feel his fingers. Children walked to school across the open prairie. Teachers opened windows. Ranchers sent hired men out to check distant stock. Marit stood at the barn vent and watched the warm air rise from the shaft in a lazy curl. The cows had stopped eating. All four stood with their heads up, ears forward, facing the sealed north wall. The pigs had burrowed deep into the straw and would not come out. By early afternoon, the sky changed, not gradually the way clouds normally built. Instantly. A wall of white moved across the western horizon like a door closing. The temperature dropped so fast that Marit, standing beside the cabin, felt the warmth leave her face between one breath and the next. Then the wind hit. The children's blizzard struck western Dakota Territory on January 12th, 1888, with a violence that people who survived it would describe for the rest of their lives as something not of this world. The morning's warmth had been a trap. The mild air had drawn people outdoors, sent children to school, scattered ranch hands across open country. When the storm front arrived, it arrived at full force. No gradual building, no warning gusts, no slow darkening. 1 minute the air was still and tolerable. The next minute visibility dropped to the length of a person's arm. The wind screamed across the flat ground at speeds that knocked livestock off their feet, and the temperature fell as if someone had opened a door into a different season entirely. Marit was 60 yards from the cabin when the wall hit. She dropped flat, the way Torgrim had taught her. If you cannot see, do not walk. Crawl until you find something fixed. and dragged herself toward the cabin by feel, her hands finding the frozen wagon rut she had memorized in the weeks of hauling earth. The wind tore at her coat. Snow drove horizontal, sharp as sand, filling her nose and mouth, and the space between her collar and her neck. She reached the cabin door and pulled it shut behind her. The door shuddered in its frame. Snow forced itself through the cracks between the planks in fine white lines that looked like threads pulled from the air itself. Eli sat on the bed with the blanket pulled to her chin. Her eyes were wide. The stove held a small fire, but the chimney was already beginning to moan and backdraft, and thin smoke leaked from the joint where the pipe met the wall plate. "Get dressed," Marit said. "Everything warm. Do not take the blanket off until I come back." "Where are you going?" "The barn." "You cannot go outside." "I am not going outside." Marit lifted the loose floorboard near the cellar opening. Warm air breathed up from the crawl space, not warm enough to heat the room, but steady, alive. She lowered herself through the gap, feet first, and dropped into the shallow cellar. The trench mouth was a dark rectangle cut into the southeast wall, framed in planks, barely tall enough to enter on hands and knees. She took the lantern, the hammer, a bundle of burlap, and a willow switch she used to test the bedding depth. She crawled into the trench. The passage was 36 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet high at the center. The earth walls were cold but not frozen. The air moved faintly toward the barn end, pulled by the heat differential. The lantern flame leaned forward, flickering, and shadows crawled along the packed clay walls. She reached the barn in minutes. What she found inside nearly stopped her. The cow heat was heavy and wet, a wall of warmth that hit her face as she climbed from the trench into the barn. The pigs had rooted the center pack wide open, tearing through the top straw layer and exposing the dark composting mass beneath. Steam rose from the gap in thick curls that caught the lantern light. The barn air was warm, far warmer than the cabin, but it smelled sharp, and the sharpness was the smell of trapped gas, of decomposition working without enough ventilation. One cow had kicked a support brace near the ramp. The forked post had shifted 3 inches from the wall, and the cross piece above it tilted at an angle that made Marit's stomach drop. If the post shifted further, the cross piece would fall, and the section of roof above it, earth, hay, brush, and pole, would follow. The edge bedding was freezing. Along the north wall, where the earth was thinnest and the wind hit hardest, the straw had gone stiff and white with frost. The composting heat reached 2/3 of the barn floor, but not the margins. The system's weakness was visible. It heated from the center out, and the center was not large enough to reach the walls. Marit worked fast. She pulled straw from the dry reserve stack, the last of the clean material Nell Katie's husband had left in the dark, and spread it thick along the frozen north edge, building a barrier between the warm center and the cold wall. She forked composting material from the deep center and pushed it toward the margins, mixing hot with cold, trying to spread the heat the way a person spreads coals from a fire's center to its edge. The pigs watched her from the far corner, snouts tucked, sides heaving. The cows shifted against her shoulders as she worked, their bodies heavy and warm and smelling of sweet hay and the sharp undernote of fear. She tested the vent. The smoking rag hung limp at floor level. Dead air. The high vent was frozen shut, ice rimed thick around the cap, sealed by the blowing snow that had packed against every exposed surface. Warm, dry keeps breathing. Torgrim's voice in her memory, as clear as if he stood beside her. She climbed the interior ladder, 4 rungs of cottonwood nailed to a wall post, and reached the vent cap. The ice was a 1/4 inch thick around the rim. She struck it with the hammer carefully, because the stovepipe was thin and a hard blow would buckle it. Ice cracked. She struck again. A chunk fell away. She struck a third time, and the cap broke free, and wind punched down the shaft with a force that knocked the lantern from her other hand. The lantern fell into the straw. She dropped from the ladder, grabbed the lantern before the flame could catch the dry surface, and held it against her chest. The glass was cracked. The flame still burned. The wind howling through the open vent shaft drove the temperature down immediately. She could feel the warmth bleeding from the barn like water from a punctured bucket. But the air moved. The smoking rag, when she tested again, crawled along the floor toward the low vent, pulled by the draft. The sharp smell thinned. The cows dropped their heads. One began to eat. She closed the high vent to half. A compromise between poison air and lost heat. The draft slowed to a whisper, enough to carry the worst gases out, not enough to steal the warmth the animals in the bedding fought to produce. Then she turned to the broken brace. The forked post had kicked out further while she worked. The cross piece now sat at a visible angle, and a thin line of dirt sifted from the roof above it, falling through the brush layer in a stream fine as sand. If the post failed, the roof section would collapse onto the ramp. The ramp was the only way the animals could exit. If the ramp was blocked and the barn filled with bad air, 4 cows and 7 pigs would suffocate in a space Marit had built to save them. She wedged the burlap behind the post to fill the gap between the wood and the wall, then drove the post back toward the wall, one hammer blow at a time. Each strike sent vibration through the crosspiece and into the roof. Dirt rained down. A cow pressed against her back, leaning into her as if seeking warmth or offering weight, and Marit braced herself against the animal's flank and swung again. The post ceded. She drove a stake at its base, angling it into the packed earth floor to prevent the post from sliding. The brace held. The dirt stopped falling. If you are invested in Marit's fight now, stay with us and subscribe, because the next hours will decide whether the tunnel saves them or turns against them. She crawled back through the trench. 36 feet of passage, dark except for the cracked lantern, warm at the barn end and cooling as she moved toward the cabin. Above her, the wind sounded like something alive, something with weight and intent, pressing on the earth that covered the trench the way a hand presses on a lid. The cabin stove had died. The chimney backdraft had smothered the fire, and smoke hung in the room at waist height. Eli sat on the bed, coughing, her face red, her eyes streaming. The cabin was 31 degrees by the thermometer on the wall, above freezing, but dropping fast. Marit did not relight the stove. The wind would backdraft again. Instead, she pulled up the loose floorboard near the bed and felt the air that came through the crawl space. It was warm, not hot, not the temperature of a room with a stove burning, but steady, and it did not carry smoke or the sharp barn smell because the trench was long enough and the draft gentle enough that the worst gases rose through the barn vent before reaching the cabin end. She moved Eli's bed directly over the open floorboard. She hung a blanket from the ceiling beam to trap the rising warmth near the bed. She tucked every remaining quilt around the girl and placed a heated stone, one she had left in the barn bedding before the storm, at Eli's feet. The cabin temperature held. It did not rise. It did not fall. The warmth from below was not enough to heat the room, but it was enough to stop the cold from winning. Outside, the wind did not stop. It built through the afternoon and into the night, and through the second night and into the morning of January 14th. The temperature fell past 20 below, past 30 below, past the point where the thermometer on the cabin wall, an unreliable instrument nailed to the exposed north plank, stopped reading anything Marit could trust. Across the draw, the Cady family huddled in a house better built than Marit's, but heated by a single stove burning through fuel at a rate that emptied their woodpile before the second dawn. They lost 2 calves in their above-ground shed. The calves froze standing up, their legs locked, their eyes open. Asa Whitcomb's hired man, a boy of 19 named Lyle, tried to walk from the bunkhouse to the barn at midday on the 13th. He became disoriented within 20 steps. They found him 2 hours later, pressed against the fence line 40 yards from the barn door, alive but with frost on his cheeks and ears that would mark him for life. Reuben Pike, a bachelor homesteader east of the Knife River, was found on the 15th beside a haystack half a mile from his soddy. His fingertips were blackened. One ear was frozen solid. He lost 3 fingers and the ear and never filed another claim. In the buried barn, the bedding core held at 118 degrees. The barn air stayed above freezing near the animals. The crawl space temperature under the cabin held at 36 degrees, and temperature not warm enough for comfort, but warm enough that the water bucket beside Eli's bed did not freeze solid, and the child's breath did not frost the air above her face. Marit crawled the trench 4 times in 2 days. Each time she checked the vent, adjusted the straw, tested the brace, read the air. Each time she returned to the cabin colder and more exhausted. She ate cold oatmeal because the stove would not draw. She slept in half-hour intervals because the vent needed checking and the brace needed watching, and the girl needed someone to press a hand against her forehead and count the breaths between coughs. On the 3rd morning, the wind dropped. The silence was so sudden and so complete that Marit woke thinking she had gone deaf. She opened the cabin door. The world was white and still and blindingly bright. The temperature stood at 32 below zero by the nailed thermometer, and the air did not move. She walked to the barn vent shaft. It was buried under 2 feet of packed snow. She dug it clear with her bare hands and opened the cap. Warm air rushed out, a column of breath from below, alive and animal and sweet with decomposing straw. She stood beside the shaft and felt the warmth on her face and closed her eyes. Then she crawled through the trench one more time and checked the animals. 4 cows standing, 7 pigs rooting, 2 calves nursing, the bedding warm, the air clean, the brace holding. She sat on the barn ramp with the hammer still in her hand and fell asleep. That is where Asa Whitcomb found her. Whitcomb stood at the top of the ramp and looked down into a barn he had expected to be a tomb. He had ridden from his own place at first light, picking a path across drifts that buried the fence posts to their wire. 2 of his range cattle were dead in the north pasture, frozen where they stood in the open. His stone-footed barn had held, but the above-ground shed on the east side had lost its roof to the wind, and 3 calves sheltered there had not survived the second night. His hired man Lyle sat in the bunkhouse with both ears bandaged and a look on his face that said he would not be staying past spring. Whitcomb had come to Marit's claim expecting the same. Worse, he had expected dead stock, a collapsed roof, a frozen child, and the grim arithmetic of a woman who had gambled everything on a theory built from manure and straw. Instead, he found 4 cows standing in warm air, chewing cud, 7 pigs rooting through bedding that steamed when they turned it, 2 calves pressed against their mother's flanks, breathing normally. The barn smelled of animals and earth and decomposing straw. Not pleasant, but not the sour reek of sickness. The air moved. He could feel the faint draft from the low vent pulling along the floor, carrying the heavier gases out, while the warmth accumulated near the roof poles and radiated downward. Marit woke when his boot scraped the ramp. She sat up with the hammer still in her hand, her face creased from sleeping against the earth wall, her eyes red with exhaustion. Whitcomb did not speak for a long time. He walked the length of the barn. He looked at the sod walls. He looked at the braced corners, the center post, the vent shaft overhead. He looked at the bedding, dry straw on top, dark composting pack beneath, drainage channel running to the sump pit at the downhill corner. He watched one pig drive its snout into the pack and turn a section of matted straw and manure, opening a seam of steam that rose in the lantern light like breath. He stopped at the spot where the kicked brace had been reset. He could see the fresh stake driven at the base, the burlap wadded behind the post, the hammer marks on the crosspiece where Marit had driven it back into place. "You fixed this during the blow," he said. "Yes." "Alone." Torgrim was not here. Whitcomb removed his glove. He knelt beside the bedding along the north wall, the section where the frost had crept during the worst of the storm, and pressed his bare hand into the straw. He pushed deeper, past the dry top layer, past the damp transition, into the composting pack where the slow fire lived. Steam moved around his wrist. The heat was unmistakable, not the warmth of a stove or a lamp, but something deeper and steadier, as if the ground itself had a pulse. He pulled his hand free and looked at it. Then he looked at Marit. "I called it a grave," he said. Marit said nothing. She was too tired for vindication and too honest to pretend she had not been afraid. "It is not a grave," Whitcomb said. He stood and brushed the straw from his knee. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not need to. The sentence carried the weight of a man revising the only conclusion he had ever reached about what was possible in this country. He walked back up the ramp and mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he turned in the saddle. "The Katie woman lost 2 calves. Her shed is open on the north side and the straw is frozen flat. If you have the strength to walk over there, she could use the advice." It was not an apology. It was something better. It was Asa Whitcomb admitting that Marit Vangen knew something he did not, and directing her towards someone who needed to know it too. Marit went to the Katie place that afternoon, despite exhaustion so deep she could feel it in her teeth. She walked the 2 miles because the mare was still lame and the mule would not leave the barn. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts and knee-deep on the open ground, and by the time she reached the Katie farmstead, her legs were shaking, and her vision had narrowed to a bright tunnel rimmed with gray. Nell Katie met her at the door with a face that had aged 10 years in 3 days. The 2 dead calves lay stiff in the yard, covered with a canvas tarp. The surviving cattle stood in a shed that was little more than a windbreak. 3 walls of rough plank, a pole roof, and an open north face that had channeled the blizzard directly onto the animals. Marit did not lecture. She did not explain the theory of composting heat or the physics of earthen insulation. She showed Nell 3 things. First, she stacked straw bales against the open north face to block the wind. Not a permanent wall, a barrier, enough to stop the direct flow of freezing air across the animals' bodies. Second, she pulled the frozen straw from the floor of the shed and replaced it with fresh bedding from the Katie's stack, layering it 2 feet deep and mixing in the manure that had accumulated during the storm. "Do not clean it out," Marit said. "Mix it in. The manure is not waste. It is fuel." Third, she cut a vent in the south wall, a square hole the size of a dinner plate, framed with a scrap of board and covered with a sliding panel that Nell could open or close. When the air smells sharp, open it. When the cold is worst, close it halfway. Never close it all the way. The animals need air more than they need heat. Nell watched every movement. She did not argue. The dead calves in the yard had ended her argument. "How did you know this would work?" Nell asked. "I did not know. I watched. The straw and the manure told me. and the animals told me, and I listened. Nell knelt beside the bedding and pressed her hand into it the way Whitcomb had done. The straw was not yet warm. It would take days for the composting to begin in the fresh material, but it was not frozen, and the layer of manure beneath the surface held a faint heat that the open shed had been wasting into the Dakota wind. My mother kept cattle in Norway, Marit said. She said a winter barn had 2 fires, the stove and the floor. It was the first time Marit had said those words to anyone except herself. They came out plainly, without drama, the way all real knowledge sounds when it finally finds the person who needs it. Over the following 2 weeks, word traveled the way word always traveled in settlement country, through visits and wagon stops and conversations at the feed store that began with weather and ended with something a neighbor had built underground. 3 families came to Marit's claim to see the barn. They came separately because pride still ran deep and no man wanted to be seen asking a woman for instruction in a group. They stood at the barn door one at a time, not entering at first, arms folded, faces set in the careful neutrality of people who needed help but did not want to look like they needed it. Marit made each of them step inside. She made them name what they felt, not what they saw, what they felt. The air is warm, the first man said, a farmer named Halvor Tveit, who had lost a yearling and 2 hens in the storm. Where's it warmest? He pointed to the center of the barn, near the pigs. Now walk to the wall. He walked to the north wall and put his hand against the sod. Cooler, but not freezing. Now look at the straw at your feet. He looked down, dry on top. He nudged it with his boot. Beneath the dry layer, the straw was dark and dense and faintly steaming. That is the fire, Marit said. It does not burn, it rots, and the rot makes heat, but only if the straw is thick enough and the drainage is right and the air moves. She showed him the vent. She showed him the sump pit. She showed him the drainage channel. She showed him the pigs turning the pack. She did not explain the chemistry because she did not know the chemistry. She knew the practice, and the practice was enough. Tveit left and came back 3 days later with his 15-year-old son. They rebuilt their cattle shelter with a windbreak, 2 feet of bedding mixed with manure, and a vent hole cut in the south wall. It was not Marit's underground barn. It was a surface adaptation, simpler, less effective, but enough to keep the remaining stock alive through the rest of the winter. The second family built a deeper bedding system in an existing root cellar, connecting it to their cabin through a gap in the stone foundation. The third family, a man and his brother, who ran a small horse operation, simply opened their sealed barn, added vents they had never considered, and stopped mucking the stalls clean. Within a week, the barn temperature rose 4 degrees. None of them built the tunnel. None of them needed to. Marit was not teaching a blueprint. She was teaching a principle. Warmth could be grown, not just burned, and an enclosed space with living animals and composting bedding was a furnace that fed itself if a person understood the balance between moisture, air, and rot. Lawson Rusk's reaction to Marit's survival was not conversion, it was recalculation. If Marit's animals lived, the debt note's leverage weakened. Live cows produced milk and calves. Milk and calves produced income. Income meant Marit could pay the note on her own terms, not Rusk's. And a woman who could pay her own debts was a woman whose claim could not be acquired at a distress price. Rusk did not attack directly. He mentioned in the store, within earshot of men who would repeat it, that underground barns bred disease, that the spring thaw would reveal sickness in the cattle that winter had hidden, that children raised above animal waste developed lung ailments that did not show for years. The words were not accusations. They were suggestions. delivered with the concerned tone of a man who worried about the welfare of a child he had never visited. They were seeds planted in the minds of people who had just watched Marit's method succeed and were not yet certain they trusted it. Marit heard the talk through Nell, who heard it through her husband, who heard it at the feed store. She filed it away. She could not fight words with words. She could only fight them with results, and results took time, and time was something Russ could afford to wait out. Torgrim returned to the claim on January 19th, 5 days after the storm broke. He came on foot, leading the mule, limping worse than before. His left hand was wrapped in cloth-stained brown with dried blood. The frostbite had taken 2 fingertips on that hand, the smallest finger and the ring finger, and the flesh around the remaining digits was white and hard in a way that did not promise healing. He had been trapped at the Lindbergh place, 8 miles northwest, where he had gone to check a widower's roof before the storm. The widower's cabin held, but Torgrim had stepped outside on the second morning to check the livestock and lost his footing on ice beneath the snow. He lay on the ground for 20 minutes before the widower found him, and in those 20 minutes, his exposed hand had frozen to a depth that no amount of slow rewarming could fully reverse. He stood in Marit's barn and looked at the reset brace. He looked at the vent cap, still bearing the hammer marks where she had broken the ice. He looked at the bedding, thick and steaming, and managed through 3 days of storm by a woman working alone in the dark. He did not say he was proud. He said something that meant more. "You changed the vent balance." I closed it to half during the blow. The full opening lost too much heat. Half was right. I would have said a third, but half was right for that wind. It was the first time he had acknowledged that her judgment had diverged from his teaching and landed closer to correct. The shift was small, and neither of them marked it with ceremony, but from that morning forward, Torgrim stopped instructing and started consulting. He asked her what she had observed before he offered what he thought. He deferred to her reading of the bedding temperature and the vent draft, because she had lived inside the system through its hardest test, and he had not. They worked together through the rest of January and into February, improving the barn in the ways that survival had revealed as necessary. They widened the trench at 2 points where Marit's shoulders had scraped the walls during the storm crawls, 4 inches on each side, enough to pass with a bucket or a lantern without catching. Torgrim showed her how to reinforce the widened sections with angled braces cut from willow poles, locking the earth in place against the spring thaw that would soften it. They built a hinged baffle between the barn and the crawl space, a plank door on leather hinges that could be opened wide during calm, cold nights to let maximum warmth through, or closed to a crack during storms when the draft risked pulling barn air into the cabin. The baffle was Torgrim's design and Marit's improvement. She added a strip of wool felt along the edges to seal the gaps, because she had felt cold air leaking through during the blizzard and knew that every leak was heat leaving. In the evenings, by the light of tallow candles, Torgrim talked. He talked about the railroad grades in Minnesota, where frozen ground had to be blasted before it could be cut. He talked about a sod house he had built near Brainerd for a woman whose husband had died of typhoid, and how the house had stood for 11 years before the woman sold the claim and moved to St. Paul. He talked about Norway, about the mountain pastures above Telemark where his father had dug drainage channels into slopes so steep that a misstep meant a fall a person did not walk away from. He talked about his knee. A rail had rolled during a grade construction near Fargo and caught his leg between the iron and a tie beam. The railroad doctor had wanted to amputate below the knee. Torgrim had refused. The knee healed crooked but functional, and he had walked on it for 23 years since, each year a little worse, each year proving the doctor's prediction a little more accurate. Marit listened. She did not offer sympathy because Torgrim did not want it. She offered what he valued more: attention, and the silence that let a man tell his story without being managed through it. Their one disagreement came in early February over the vent caps. Torgrim wanted to replace the barrel hoop caps with proper tin cones that would shed snow and resist ice buildup. Marit said the tin cones would freeze faster than the barrel hoop design because metal conducted cold, and the hoops, wrapped in burlap, insulated the cap opening. They argued for an hour beside the vent shaft. Torgrim cited railroad ventilation practice. Marit cited what she had seen during the blizzard, the ice forming on metal first and thickest, the burlap-wrapped sections staying clear longer. Torgrim looked at the vent. He looked at Marit. He unwrapped the burlap from the cap and felt the metal beneath. It was colder than the wrapped section by a margin his bare hand could measure. "Keep the burlap," he said. He said it without embarrassment and without the stiffness of a man conceding. He said it the way a builder says it when a better solution is a better solution, regardless of who found it. It was a small moment that changed the architecture of their partnership more than any dramatic scene could have. Marit was no longer the student. She was the person who lived inside the system, and her knowledge was empirical in a way that Torgrim's experience, vast as it was, could not match. By late February, Torgrim's frostbitten hand had worsened. The two lost fingertips had healed poorly, and the remaining fingers on his left hand curled inward and would not straighten. His knee, punished by the weeks of digging and the fall at the Lindbergh place, swelled to twice its normal size after any sustained work. He moved through the barn with the careful deliberation of a man whose body was delivering a final accounting for decades of labor in frozen ground. He did not complain. He adjusted. He taught himself to drive nails with his right hand only. He learned to use the willow switch to test bedding depth, because his left hand could no longer push through the straw. He sat when he would have stood and rested when he would have worked, and the pride that had carried him through 23 years on a broken knee began to thin at the edges, like ice on a warming creek. On the 4th of March, Torgrim did not come to the barn in the morning. Marit found him in the cabin, sitting on the chair beside the stove, his left hand pressed against his chest and his face the color of ash. "The hand?" she asked. "The hand. And the rest?" He had a fever. The infection from the frostbite had traveled past the wrist and into the forearm, turning the skin red and hot in a line that pointed toward the elbow. Marit knew what that line meant. She had seen it on a neighbor's child in Benson County, and that child had been buried within the month. She sent Eli to the Katy place with a note asking Nell to bring the turpentine and the clean cloth. She heated water. She unwrapped Torgrim's hand and cleaned the wounds with salt water and packed them with a poultice of bread and warm milk, the only drawing agent she had. She did not know whether it would work. She knew that doing nothing would not. Torgrim lay on Marit's bed that night and listened to the sounds beneath the floor, the shifting of cows, the low grunt of pigs, the settling of straw, the faint creak of the trench timbers as the earth around them shifted in the cold. "You listen to earth before you listen to men," he said. His voice was thin. "Keep doing that." He was not giving her a lesson. He was giving her a summary, the single sentence that contained everything he had tried to teach through shovels and braces and smoke tests and sloped walls. Listen to the ground, read the straw, feel the air, trust what the system tells you over what any person claims to know. Torgrim Nesheim died on the 9th of March, 1888, in Marit Vangen's cabin, with the sound of animals breathing beneath the floorboards and the warmth of composting straw rising through 36 feet of covered trench into the crawl space under his bed. Marit sat beside him for an hour after his breathing stopped. She did not speak. She did not pray. She held his right hand, the one that still worked, the one that had taken the shovel from her grip on a November morning and cut the wall at a slant and said, "Straight sides bury people." And she let the silence fill the room the way warmth filled the crawl space. Slowly, from below, without flame. She buried him on the rise above the barn, where the earth was softest because the heat from below had kept the frost from reaching full depth. She dug the grave with the same shovel he had corrected her with, cutting the walls at a slant, setting no unsupported span longer than 6 feet because the lessons lived in her hands now and would not leave. Eli placed a stone at the head. Marit placed the wedge hammer beside it. She would retrieve the hammer later when the grief permitted, because tools that good did not belong in the ground. But for the morning, the hammer lay on the frozen sod beside the stone, and the vent shaft 10 yards away breathed warm air into the cold sky, and somewhere beneath the earth, the pigs turned the straw, and the cows breathed, and the fire without flame continued its work. The secondary crisis arrived in November of 1888, 10 months after the blizzard, when winter returned and brought with it the test Marit had not anticipated, other people's survival depending on her knowledge. A woman named Barbara Espelon, 23, wife of a dryland farmer 4 miles south, went into labor during the first hard storm of the season. The labor was early. The midwife was in Dickinson. The Espelon cabin was heated by a single stove burning green wood, and the temperature inside dropped to 40 degrees when the chimney backdrafted in the wind. Nell Katie rode to Marit's claim through the blowing snow and pounded on the door at 9 in the evening. "Barbara is laboring. The cabin is cold. The baby will not survive a cold birth." Marit did not ask questions. She pulled on her coat, took the lantern, and rode the remaining healthy mare through drifts that reached the animal's chest. She arrived at the Espelon place an hour before midnight. The cabin was exactly the kind of shelter Marit had been given a year before. Plank walls, sod backing, a stove too small for the space, and a chimney too short for the wind. Barbara lay on the bed wrapped in every blanket the household owned, her face white with pain and cold. Marit assessed the space in minutes. The stove could not be trusted in the wind. The cabin had no cellar, no trench, no underground connection, but it had a cattle shed 20 yards from the back door, and the shed had 4 walls, a roof, and 3 cows standing in shallow straw. She could not build what she had at home. She did not need to. She needed to create enough warmth in the shed to bring the laboring woman into the animal heat and keep the baby from entering the world in freezing air. She directed Nell and Barbara's husband in the dark. Stack every piece of straw in the shed to 3 feet deep around the cows. Block the door gap with a blanket. Do not open the vent. There was no vent, which was a problem she would solve after the birth. Bring the bedding from the cabin, the quilts, the heated stones from the stove, and lay them in the cleanest corner of the shed, as far from the cattle as the small space allowed, but close enough to benefit from the animal heat. Barbara was carried to the shed at midnight. She labored in the warmth of 3 cows and 3 feet of straw, surrounded by the smell of animals and earth, and the baby arrived before dawn, a girl, small and loud and alive. The shed air turned sharp by morning. Without a vent, the accumulated gases from the animals and the composting straw had nowhere to go. Marit punched a hole through the south wall with a fence post and covered it with a feed sack that she could lift or lower. The draft pulled the bad air out. Fresh cold came in. She adjusted the sack to a gap the width of 2 fingers, enough to breathe, not enough to freeze. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival often begins long before the storm arrives. The Espeland baby survived. Barbro recovered, and Marit rode home through the dawn light, knowing that the method was no longer hers alone. It belonged to whoever needed it, and the number of people who needed it would grow with every winter that came. But the method also had enemies, and the most dangerous enemy was not cold. It was carelessness dressed as imitation. Within weeks of the Espeland birth, Lawson Rusk began selling what he called Vangan straw at his store. Bundles of old hay and straw sold at premium price with the promise that deep bedding would heat any barn. The bundles were cheap material cut from fields where mold had already started, packed tight and sold wet. One family who bought the straw and packed their cattle shed with it found the bedding turning black and sour within days. Their animals sickened. One calf died of scours. The talk turned against Marit before she knew it had started. The family blamed the method. Rusk shook his head in the store and said he had warned about underground air and animal sickness. The phrase Vangan straw became two things at once: the bedding system that worked and the moldy product that did not. And the confusion served Rusk's interests because confusion kept people afraid, and afraid people sold their stock cheaply. Merritt learned about the straw bundles from Nell, who had seen them stacked at the store. She rode to Dickinson on a morning so cold the mare's breath froze on the reins. She did not confront Rusk with anger. She walked into the store, took one of the straw bundles from the display stack, and tore it open on the floor in front of the men sitting by the stove. The straw inside was dark with mold. Black threads ran through the compressed center. The smell was immediate, sour, sharp, the acrid reek of anaerobic rot, the exact opposite of the sweet, earthy warmth that healthy composting straw produced. "This is not what I use," Marit said. "This is what kills calves." She held up a handful of the moldy straw. "Look at the color, smell it. This straw was wet when it was baled, and it has been rotting without air. No drainage, no turning, no oxygen. Put this in a barn, and the animals breathe poison." She dropped the straw on the floor. She looked at Rusk, who stood behind the counter with the expression of a man whose arithmetic had just been checked in public. "If you sell this to one more family," Marit said, "the next calf that dies will have your name on it, not mine." She walked out. She did not look back. The men by the stove looked at the moldy straw on the floor and then at Rusk, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound the store had heard all winter. The moldy straw stayed on the floor of Rusk and Bell Dry Goods for 3 days. No one cleaned it up. The men who sat by the stove stepped around it and said nothing to Rusk, and the saying nothing was its own kind of verdict. Because in a country where a man's word was his currency, silence from the men who usually agreed with you was the sound of credit running out. Rusk pulled the remaining bundles from the display and did not replace them. He did not apologize. He did not mention Marit's name in the store again for the rest of the winter, but the damage he had done with the moldy straw lingered in the minds of people who had not seen Marit tear the bundle open, and those people, the ones who had only heard the phrase Vangan straw and associated it with a dead calf, carried the doubt with them into spring like a stone in a coat pocket they kept meaning to throw away but never did. Marit could not chase the doubt from house to house. She could only build against it, the same way she had built against the cold, with visible, measurable, undeniable results. By the spring of 1889, the buried barn had survived its first full cycle, and the cycle itself had become Marit's strongest argument. The deep pack that had heated the barn through winter did not vanish when the snow melted. It composted further in the warming months, breaking down into dark, crumbly material that smelled like clean soil and held moisture without drowning. Marit forked it out of the barn in April, a labor that took 2 weeks of steady work, because the pack had compressed to 18 inches of dense material across the entire barn floor and weighed more per forkful than the straw that had gone in. She spread it on the 12 broken acres. The effect was visible within weeks. The wheat came up thicker and greener on the composted sections than on the ground that had received nothing. The oats stood taller. Even the wild grass along the field margins grew differently where the composted bedding had been spread, denser, darker, holding the spring rain longer instead of letting it sheet off into the draw. The compost was the argument Russ could not answer, because compost was not theory or reputation or a woman's word against a storekeeper's. It was crop growth a person could see from the road. Halvor Tveit drove past Marit's wheat field in May and stopped his wagon to look. He had spread the same seed on his own ground, and his wheat stood 4 inches shorter. "What did you put on this field?" Tveit asked. "The barn floor." He stared at her. Then he stared at the wheat. Then he drove home and began planning a deeper bedding system for his cattle shed. The cycle closed. Winter bedding produced heat that kept animals alive, and the spent bedding produced compost that grew better feed, and better feed produced healthier animals that generated more heat and more manure. The system fed itself. It was not a single innovation. It was a loop. And once a person understood the loop, every part of the farm looked different. Marit did not explain it as a loop. She showed it. When neighbors came, and by the second winter they came regularly, sometimes from as far as the Knife River Ford 10 miles south, she walked them through the barn first, then the compost pile, then the field. She let them see the connection without naming it. The ones who understood it changed how they farmed. The ones who did not went home and did what they had always done, and Marit did not judge them for it, because understanding required a kind of patience that not everyone carried. Her teaching method was physical. She put tools in people's hands. She made Nell Kadi smell the difference between anaerobic rot, sour, sharp, ammonia thick, and aerobic composting, earthy, warm, almost sweet. She made Tveit's son push a willow rod into a composting pack and feel the heat gradient from surface to core. She made children keep their lamps away from dry straw by holding a lit candle near a loose handful and letting them see how fast the flame caught. The lesson lasted longer than any warning. She kept Torgrim's methods alive by teaching them as if they were her own, because by now they were. Slope the walls, brace every 6 feet, grade the floor for drainage, test the air with smoke, listen to the ground before you trust the plan. These were not rules she recited. They were habits built into her hands and her posture and the way she entered a barn, one breath at the door to read the air before stepping inside, the way Torgrim had taught her without ever saying, "Do this." She had learned by watching him do it, and others learned by watching her. The second winter brought its own test. Marit had improved the barn during the warm months. The trench was wider now, a proper crouch passage a person could move through without scraping both shoulders. She had added a hinged baffle at the crawlspace junction, rebuilt the vent caps with Torgrim's barrel hoop design, reinforced by an outer frame of cedar strips, and lined the sump pit with flat stones mortared in place with clay so the drainage would not shift during the spring melt. She had also marked the barn wall with notches showing bedding depth. 1 foot was too thin. The composting mass did not reach the temperature needed to generate meaningful heat. 2 feet began to hold. 3 feet, properly managed, could heat the barn air above freezing even when the outside temperature dropped to 30 below. The notches became a teaching tool. When Tveit and his son came to study the system in October, Marit pointed to the marks and said, "Below this line, you are keeping animals in a cold room. Above it, you are keeping them in a furnace that feeds itself. The difference is 1 foot of straw." The measurement was simple enough that a child could remember it, and specific enough that a grown man could act on it without guessing. That combination, simple enough to remember, specific enough to use, was the reason the method spread. People did not adopt it because Marit was persuasive. They adopted it because the instructions were clear, and the results were visible, and the alternative was another winter of frozen calves and empty haylofts. By December of 1889, at least 4 families within 10 miles of the Knife River breaks had adopted some version of the system. Not all of them built underground barns. Some deepened their existing bedding and added vents. Some banked earth against their barn walls and sealed the north face. Some built windbreaks from sod and stacked straw 3 feet deep and let the cows and the manure do the rest. Each adaptation was different. Each worked to the degree that the operator understood the principles: drainage, ventilation, bedding depth, and the willingness to let manure do its work instead of mucking it out at the first sign of smell. The families who understood the principles kept their stock alive. The families who copied the visible parts without understanding the invisible ones, the drainage, the air movement, the moisture balance, had mixed results, and some of those mixed results gave Rusk ammunition for another season of quiet doubt. But Rusk's ammunition was running low, and the reason was not Marit's arguments. It was Rusk's own livery. The cold spell came in January of 1890, not as sudden as the children's blizzard, but longer and deeper. 2 weeks of temperatures below 25 that crept to 35 below on the worst nights and stayed there. The kind of cold that did not kill in a single blow, but ground an operation down over days, freezing water lines, cracking axles, and weakening animals that had to burn feed just to keep their core temperature stable. Rusk's livery barn in Dickinson was a proper frame structure with a shingle roof and plank walls and a cast iron stove in the tack room. It housed his own team, 3 border horses, and 2 dairy cows he kept for the store. It was the kind of barn a man built when he had money and a carpenter and no reason to think about heat beyond the stove and the blankets on the horses' backs. The stove burned through a cord of wood in 4 days. The wood supply was adequate, but the heat distribution was not. The stove warmed the tack room and the nearest stalls, but the far end of the barn stayed cold enough that the water buckets froze overnight, and the border horses developed the dull coats and stiff joints of animals burning more energy than their feed replaced. Rusk sealed the barn tighter to hold the stove heat. He closed the loft vents. He shut the door gaps with rags and nailed boards over the gaps in the siding. The temperature inside rose. So did the moisture. Without ventilation, the air turned wet and heavy. Condensation dripped from the roof boards. The bedding, never thick enough to begin with, went damp, and then soggy, and then sour. The ammonia smell thickened until the horses coughed, and the dairy cows dropped their milk production by half. On the 8th day, one of the border horses developed heaves, the labored breathing that came from lungs damaged by bad air. The horse's owner, a cattleman named Dahl, who ran a spread south of town, arrived to check on his animal and walked into a barn that smelled like a cellar flooded with urine. Dahl did not shout. He pulled his horse from the stall, led it into the open air, and told Rusk that if the horse did not recover, the replacement cost would come out of the boarding fee and the balance out of Rusk's reputation. That evening, Rusk sent a boy to Marit's claim with a message. The message did not say help. It said, "Tell me what to open." Marit rode to Dickinson the next morning. She did not hurry. She did not refuse. She did not gloat. She walked into Rusk's barn, took one breath at the door, the habit Torgrim had built into her body, and knew within 3 seconds what was wrong. "Everything is closed," she said. "Open the loft vents. Open the south door to a crack the width of a hand. Pull the wet bedding and replace it with dry straw, at least 2 feet deep. Stop cleaning the manure out. Mix it into the straw." Rusk stood with his arms at his sides. His face held the expression of a man being told to do the opposite of everything he believed about keeping a barn. If I open the vents, I lose the stove heat. The stove heat is killing your animals. They do not need hot air. They need clean air and dry bedding. The bedding will make its own heat if you let it. You want me to leave manure on the floor. I want you to use it. The manure and the straw together compost. The composting makes heat. The heat comes from below, where the animals stand. The stove heats the air above their heads. The bedding heats the ground beneath their feet. Which do you think matters more to a horse? Rusk did not answer. He looked at the barn floor, thin, wet straw over hard-packed dirt, pooled with urine that had nowhere to drain. You need drainage, Marit said. Dig a shallow channel from the far wall to the door, 1/2 inch of fall across every yard. Line it with gravel if you have it, stones if you do not. The water must move or the bedding drowns. She did not do the work for him. She made him pick up the shovel. They worked side by side for 3 hours. Rusk dug the drainage channel while Marit directed the grade. His hired man pulled the wet bedding and replaced it with dry straw from the loft, the straw Rusk had been saving for spring feed, which was now the only clean material available. Marit opened the loft vents herself, climbing the ladder and knocking the nailed boards free with the back of a hammer. Cold air poured in. The barn temperature dropped. Rusk flinched. Wait, Marit said. By the next morning, the fresh straw had begun to absorb the moisture from the animals, and the manure mixed into its lower layers. The drainage channel pulled standing water toward the door, where it froze in a thin sheet on the threshold, ugly, but outside the barn. The air smelled cleaner. The cows ate. The horses stopped coughing. By the 3rd day, the bedding was warm to the touch at the center. Rusk knelt and pressed his hand into it the way Whitcomb had done a year before, the way Nell had done, the way every person did who encountered the heat for the first time and needed to feel it to believe it. He did not say he was wrong. He said, "Tell me what to open." And he said it again to the men at the stove when they asked what had changed in the livery. She told me what to open. The conversion was grudging and incomplete and delivered without grace, and it was more honest for all of those reasons because Lawson Rusk was not a man who changed his mind easily, and the fact that he changed it at all was the strongest endorsement Marit's method had received. He never apologized for the moldy straw. He never acknowledged the doubt he had spread, but he stopped spreading it. And in a community where reputation moved like water through gravel, slowly, invisibly, and impossible to push back upstream, the silence from the man who had been the loudest critic was its own kind of declaration. Knut Moen arrived in the Knife River country in the spring of 1890, driving a wagon loaded with a portable forge, an anvil, and a temperament as stubborn as the iron he shaped. He was 31, Norwegian-born, trained as a blacksmith in Stavanger, and built like the things he made, broad, dense, and difficult to move once he had decided where to stand. He had come west because a blacksmith in Stavanger competed with 14 other blacksmiths, and a blacksmith in Dakota territory competed with the weather, which was a fairer fight. He met Marit because a hinge on the barn's baffle door had broken, and Nell Katie told her the new smith in Dickinson could forge a replacement faster than Marit could carve one from wood. Marit brought the broken hinge to his shop. Knut examined it, turned it over, and asked what it was for. A door between an underground barn and a cabin crawl space. He looked at her the way people looked at her when she said things like that, with the pause that meant the sentence needed a second hearing before it made sense. "Show me," he said. She brought him to the claim. He walked the barn, the trench, the crawl space, the cabin. He studied the vent caps, the drainage channel, the bedding, the braces. He asked no questions until he had seen everything, and then he asked only one. What fails first? The vent caps, Marit said. They freeze in storms. The barrel hoop design works, but the wire corrodes and the burlap rots after one season. Knut returned 3 days later with a vent cap forged from strap iron, a cone that pivoted on a pin, with a counterweight that kept it cracked open even when ice built on the rim. The design was clever. It was also wrong. The iron conducted cold faster than the burlap-wrapped barrel hoop, and the pivot froze solid on the first night below zero. Marit showed him the frozen pivot without comment. She did not need to say anything. The ice said it for her. Knut took the cap back to his shop. He returned a week later with a revised design, the same pivot mechanism, but the cone wrapped in a double layer of oiled canvas that insulated the metal from the air, and the pivot pin seated in a brass sleeve packed with tallow that resisted freezing down to 15 below. It worked. The cap pivoted through the next 3 cold snaps without seizing. The canvas insulation kept the ice from building on the cone surface. The tallow-packed sleeve moved freely when Marit tested it at dawn after a night of 22 below. You fixed it, Marit said. You told me what was wrong. Fixing is the easy part. The partnership built itself from that exchange, correction offered without contempt, correction received without defensiveness. Knut forged better tools for the barn, iron straps for the braces, a hinged grate for the sump pit that could be lifted for cleaning, a set of hooked rods for pulling straw into the trench from the barn end without crawling the full passage. Marit paid him in milk and butter and the use of the composted bedding for his garden behind the shop. They married in the autumn of 1891 in a small Lutheran service attended by Nell and her husband, Halvor Tveit, and his son, Asa Whitcomb, and his wife, and 11 other neighbors who had learned something from Marit's barn and come to think of her less as the strange woman who kept pigs under her floor and more as the person they visited before winter. The wedding was brief. The reception was held in the barn because it was the warmest room on the claim and because Marit had a sense of humor about the space that had defined her life for 3 years. The pigs were moved to a pen for the afternoon. The cows stayed. Knut moved his forge to the claim and built a proper shop beside the cabin. He expanded the cabin itself over the next 2 years, adding a second room, replacing the tarred canvas roof with shingles, rebuilding the sod-back wall in frame and plank. The cellar was deepened. The crawl space was lined with stone. The trench remained still functional, still breathing warm air into the cabin floor on the coldest nights. Eli grew into a girl who could read weather signs by the color of the morning sky and the behavior of the cattle. She managed the dairy herd by the time she was 14 and could smell the difference between healthy composting and anaerobic rot from 10 feet away, the way some children could identify bird calls, not through study, but through a childhood spent inside the sound. The years compressed the way years do when a life settles into its rhythm. By 1891, Marit's original sunken barn had become the model for 3 modified barns in the area. Tveit built a bank barn, dug into a hillside with the south face open and the north face buried, deep bedding inside, vents at the roof line. The Cadies rebuilt their cattle shed with earth-banked walls, a proper drainage channel, and the 3-foot bedding depth Marit had marked on her barn wall. A horse rancher named Sjur Haugland adapted the vent system for a larger barn, using iron caps Knut had forged from the revised design. Not everyone copied the tunnel. Not everyone needed to. The tunnel was Marit's solution to Marit's problem, a cabin too far from a barn, a winter too fierce for an open passage, a woman working alone who needed to reach her stock without stepping into a blizzard. The principle was simpler than the structure. Keep the bedding deep, keep the air moving, keep the drainage flowing, and trust the animals and the straw to do what stoves and coal could not. Marit never became rich. The claim produced milk, butter, calves, and compost. Knut's forge produced tools and repairs, and the occasional vent cap sold to a neighbor who had finally admitted that burlap and wire were not enough. Together they earned enough to pay off Rusk's note in the spring of 1889, $47.60, delivered in coin and butter, and a look on Marit's face that Rusk received without comment. She became the person people visited before winter. Not a teacher with a classroom or a title, but a woman whose barn you walked through in October if you wanted your animals alive in March. She showed people the notches on the wall. She made them feel the bedding with their own hands. She taught them to read the air with a smoking rag and to listen for the cracking sound that meant a wall brace was shifting. And she told every single one of them the same thing Torgrim had told her, in the same plain voice, without decoration. Listen to the earth before you listen to men. Her hands never fully recovered from the winters of digging and building. The knuckles stayed swollen. The fingers curled slightly inward, the way Torgrim's had, as if shaped by the memory of gripping a shovel handle in frozen clay. She kept Torgrim's wedge hammer by the barn door for 20 years, and when visitors asked about it, she said it belonged to the man who taught her to slope a wall so the earth would not bury her. Knut died in 1912 of pneumonia, in the same bed where Torgrim had died, above the same crawl space, warmed by the same fire without flame. Eli, by then a married woman with a dairy operation of her own 3 miles south, sat beside him the way Marit had sat beside Torgrim, silent, holding a hand, letting the sounds from below fill the room. Marit lived on the claim alone after that, managing the herd with a hired boy and the habits of a body that had done the work so long it did not know how to stop. She walked the barn every morning at dawn. She read the air with one breath at the door. She checked the vents, the drainage, the bedding depth, and the braces in that order, the way Torgrim had taught her without words, by doing it the same way every day until the sequence lived in her bones. In 1921, a younger neighbor named Peder Lunde built a version of the underground barn with concrete footings, a proper vented roof framed in milled lumber, and a drainage system that emptied into a stone-lined cistern. Marit walked through it on the day it was finished. She ran her hand along the concrete wall. She opened the vent and watched the smoke draw. She pressed her palm into the bedding and felt the heat, and she smiled. Not because the barn was better than hers, though it was in every material way, but because the principle had survived the translation from one pair of hands to another, from sod and straw and cottonwood poles to concrete and lumber and iron, from a woman digging alone in November clay to a man building with neighbors and plans and a level. Marit Vangen died in 1923, on the claim, in the bed above the crawl space, in the room that Knut had expanded and Eli had papered with cloth and Torgrim had never seen finished. She was 62. Her hands were curled. The wedge hammer sat by the barn door where it had sat for 35 years. By the early 1890s, 6 families within 10 miles of the Knife River breaks had adopted some part of what Marit built: deeper bedding, better ventilation, banked earth walls, composting floors, or protected passages between house and stock. Not one of them built the exact tunnel. Every one of them understood the principle it contained, that warmth could be grown from what the land and the animals already provided, if a person had the patience to manage it and the stubbornness to trust it when the men at the stove said it could not be done. Marit Vangen lived her life on 160 acres of Dakota prairie. She raised Eli, married Knut, buried Torgrim, outlasted Rusk, and became the person whose barn floor people touched with their bare hands in October, to remember what the cold would require of them in January. She never published a pamphlet. She never spoke to a crowd. She taught the way her mother had taught her, hand in the straw. Feel the warmth, Now you know. The January wind returned every year to the Knife River country, the way it always had and always would. It crossed the open prairie at speeds that knocked fences flat and froze standing water solid in an hour. It drove snow through cracks a knife blade could not find. It killed cattle in exposed sheds and cracked the mortar between stones and tested every joint and brace and vent cap on every barn within 50 miles of Dickinson. And beneath Marit's cabin, beneath the floorboards Knut had laid, and Eli had walked on as a barefoot child, the cows shifted, the pigs rooted, the straw settled, and heat rose through 36 feet of covered trench without a flame. A child from the Tveit family stood on those floorboards during a hard freeze, years after the blizzard, and laughed because the boards were warm. The men had looked at the tunnel and seen filth. Marit Vangen had looked at the same dark trench and seen a fire the prairie could not blow out,